Today on Stronger Than Reason, we talk about KMFDM's lost album, Naive. Welcome to Stronger Than Reason. So, when I think about the alternative, electronic, and industrial albums of yore, and consider how many of them have become collector's items, I come up pretty empty. Sure, there are always hard-to-find releases, particularly if you're chasing import singles. That market was a mess with bands like New Order and Depeche Mode. It's not really practical or even possible as a collector to find everything. But I'm talking about whole albums here. How many of these bands have shelved a whole album or just taken it out of print? Not many. There's a strong incentive these days to scrape the vaults completely clean. Nearly everything that a band records eventually finds its way into an exclusive collection or download, often as a way to get we, the punters, to pony up for yet another compilation album. See every compilation that New Order's done in the past 30 years, for an example. London Records has been shameless in milking that goat. So not much remains unreleased or secret. Of course, there are albums that some bands wish would go away, like Ministry's With Sympathy, for instance, although Al seems to be finally coming around on that one. He seems to be mellowing in his old age and playing acoustic versions of those songs. And for sure, there are some released things that were properly released but are still really hard to find, like this copy of Coil's unreleased themes from Hellraiser that I stumbled across in a shop 30 years ago, though I think they did eventually release some of this material on Blacklight District. I also have this cool CD edition of New Order's 1981-1982 EP, which was only released in Canada, to my knowledge. Look at that cool silver disc. That's really a nice package. It's funny, I had to special order this from some crazy dealer back in the day. This was before Amazon or eBay. It was some mail-order music rarities guy I dealt with. He used to send me a paper catalog. And today, kids would probably say he was sus or sketch, but, you know, he really came through with this thing. Anyway, that's what we had to deal with back in the day to be a collector. But what about legendary unfinished albums? Well, there was KMFDM's Apart, which I discussed way back in episode 6 when I talked about their album Money, which was the album that Apart eventually became. Now, Wax Trax refused to release Apart as it was. They claimed it sounded nothing like KMFDM. But strangely, lightning would strike KMFDM twice. Not only would Apart drift off into the world of coulda-beens, but soon after they would lose their previous album, this time due to the 1990s equivalent of a copyright strike. So one song had a sample on it that the owner refused to clear, and the entire album was pulled from the shelves, completely recalled. Now, the original album was actually issued twice. The original release was on Wax Trax, and the second printing was on TVT after they bought Wax Trax. And I was lucky enough to pick up a second printing when it was still new, still in shrink wrap on the rack in the store before any of this went down. I had no idea this version of the album would become a collector's item, or that the album itself would prove to be a fan favorite. It's possibly the first of many must-have industrial albums from the 1990s. Fans still hold it in high regard, both the original version and the two reissued variants that have come out over the years, because it's the album where KMFDM fully embraced their modern sound, the ultra-heavy beat with metal guitar riffs. This is the first album with guitarist Gunter Schultz, although he's credited here as Svetlana Ambrosius. But he would write many, many songs with Sasha Konietzko, the KMFDM main man, over the years, not to overlook the contributions and sheer weirdness factor of N. Esch, who was playing drums and guitar and singing. Their three-way partnership would drive much of KMFDM's success throughout the 1990s. They would produce 7 fantastic albums in that decade, but the first would be this one, released in November 1990, and of course, I'm talking about Naive. So here it is, finally, getting to this album. Let's talk about first hearing Naive. So I bought this exact CD when I was in the big city in 1992. I was visiting a cool underground record store, which was my priority whenever I went to any city back in those days. I got it on a whim. Like I said, it was still widely available at the time. My KMFDM experience to that point was having Money on cassette, which was the newest album in 1992. And again, I talked about Money way back in episode 6, only because it's probably my favorite KMFDM album since it was the first one I ever listened to. I might have also had the Vogue single at that point on CD, and I also had their first album, What Do You Know, Deutschland, on cassette. That was their first album if you don't count Opium, which I don't, since Opium was really a re-recording of their early demos, and I don't really want to get into that. But What Do You Know wasn't really a favorite of mine. It has a totally different sound. It's much less aggressive, less in your face. There's fewer guitars to speak of. It was strange, and it was strange in a way that I don't really dig. I doubt I'll ever talk about that one. Maybe the less said about it, the better. But Naive looked very promising. I didn't know anything about it going in other than this was the album before Money. So I took it home, I gave it a whirl, and I was pleasantly surprised. Musically, it was very akin to Money. It was a bit more raw. It was less verse, chorus, verse. A bit more industrial sounding. It was generally electronic dance music with metal riffs. It was really going in that direction, even more so than their previous album, which was UAIOE. And I definitely want to talk about that one someday. I should also point out that none of my friends were that into KMFDM, although this does remind me of a funny story, because around that time, I think it was 92, summer of 92, I was drafted to play bass keyboard in a local industrial band, and the guys in that band were super into KMFDM. And, I remember us trying to play Godlike one afternoon, which we did very imperfectly. And it's a funny memory because those guys did eventually go pro, and they did wind up having a degree of success. In fact, I see that they're still on Metropolis Records right now. So there you go. I'm not going to say who they are because to me, they're just a couple of guys from my hometown that I met through some mutual friends. And it's funny to think back on because when I showed up to play with them that first time, I was dragging along a big-ass Casio keyboard, like not even a synth. It was nothing cool. I don't know why they didn't just kick me out, but they were okay with that. And I think it's because, like I said in the previous episode, there was this whole attitude at the time that we just wanted to make music, and it didn't matter that we didn't have professional gear. Like, none of us could afford pro gear. We had to make do with what we had. So, any musicians that we had around town were very accepting in that regard. And I guess these guys, we practiced in their basement, and the funny part was there was a huge drum set down there. It belonged to the one guy's dad, and he refused to let us play it. But of course, we ended up playing it without his permission. But whatever. It's just an odd memory. I was only involved with them for a couple of sessions before I think they discovered Cakewalk or something and decided they could record an entire album without anyone else. So they just did it on their own. In fact, the last time I saw those guys was at a KMFDM concert in 1997 on the Symbols tour. So yeah, we were all KMFDM fans. So let's look at the packaging here. Let's take a look at the songs. As a kid, the one thing that really stood out to me was that this record had a version of Godlike on it, which was the big hit, of course. And it says here that it's the Chicago Tracks version produced by Paul Barker and Lee Popa. Now, I had no idea who Lee Popa was. I later found out he was the lead singer in the Slammin' Watusis, but, I had no idea of that then. But naturally, I knew Paul Barker was in Ministry, so there was a connection there that made it obvious here. And of course, later I'd find out that before Naive was released, KMFDM were playing a lot of these songs when they opened for Ministry on the notorious tour For the Mind is a Terrible Thing to Taste. So Naive was their first album on Wax Trax. They recorded this album after the tour when they permanently relocated to America. I'm sure the music on Naive was influenced by that touring experience. The way Sasha tells it, KMFDM arrived in the U.S. for the first time thinking that Ministry were still playing synth pop, like on With Sympathy. and we're pretty surprised to find essentially a metal band with 3 guitarists and 2 drummers. So they beefed up their own set appropriately. Most of the songs here on Naive feature heavy guitar riffing and KMFDM's trademark ultra-heavy beat. However, the version of Godlike here was not exactly what I was expecting. I'll talk more about that, though, when we get into the track-by-track. The other thing I noticed was that this album actually had liner notes, unlike other KMFDM releases for the most part. So if you open this up, there's a picture of Sasha and Enesh. Enesh has hair, which is strange to see. All of these liner notes are handwritten, and, there's some odd stuff in here. They credit a doctor for Enesh's surgery. It turns out Enesh was caught in a building fire during this time and had to jump out of a 3rd-story window to save himself, which, resulted in some injuries. And I understand that was also the impetus for his longtime habit of shaving all the hair from his body. So there you go. That's how that happened. Inside here, we have lyrics. Some of these are in English, some are in German. This CD has 11 tracks. The vinyl album had just 9, so there are 2 extras here. We have a supposedly live version of Disgust, which appeared in its original form on their 2nd album, Don't Blow Your Top, and this version of Godlike. Again, they always threw in that extra material in the 1990s to give you an incentive to buy the CD. Later versions and reissues would have a bunch of other remixes and things, but I'll talk about those a little later. You can also see here that this disc I have is the Wax Trax TVT version. So it's the same content as the original Wax Trax release, which I did also own at one time, but I sold it back in the 90s when I just needed the cash. The other thing of note here, of course, we have to mention the cover art. And the cover art is generally the same, more or less, on every KMFDM release. That's one of the things that we like about KMFDM is they're stylistically consistent. It was done by Aidan Hughes, a.k.a. Brute. In this case, Brute explained this particular cover as the man being naive to this explosion or cataclysm that's happening behind him. Now, the original printings all have the art in orange and the album name in white, and they're pretty highly sought after. Later versions of the album will have the art in green or the album name in orange, and they've got different content, so just be aware of that if you're doing the collector thing. Once I became more of a fan of this band, though, and got more familiar with their discography, I understood that they like to recycle some of these songs. So, for instance, Godlike had been released as a single prior to Naive. However, the version here is supposedly the first version that they ever recorded. So, recorded first, released second. Virus Dub is a remix of Virus, which came out on a single in 1989. Freed is listed as a remix since the original version was a B-side to Godlike, which was the single just before Naive. And as I said, Disgust is kind of a faster version of the original tune, which was recorded at a much slower tempo on Don't Blow Your Top. And in turn, these songs on Naive would then get fed into the mulcher for future KMFDM work. So for instance, the lyrics to the title track Naive would show up again on the song Salvation in 2014. The lyrics to Die Now, Live Later would reappear on Money's Under Satan. I talked about, in the episode about KMFDM's album Angst, in episode 30, how the lyrics to the song A Hole in the Wall were just the English equivalent of the German lyrics here to Liebeslide. This is all part of the principle of conceptual continuity, which Sasha borrowed from Frank Zappa, being a big fan of Frank's. So KMFDM as a project is kind of like a big Ouroboros. It's just a snake that's always eating its own tail. So why was this album recalled? What was the big deal? Well, it had to do with an unlicensed sample on Liebeslide, track 7. So Sasha had a sample from Karl Orff's Carmina Burana, specifically from the opening track O Fortuna. Orff's Carmina Burana is a cantata or a choral piece, and the point of O Fortuna is pretty much to draw you in and just stun you with vocal dynamics and power. And as such, it's a piece of music that's very popular. I'm sure you'd recognize it if you heard it. It's in a lot of things. It was in the films Excalibur and Cheaper by the Dozen. It was in TV shows like Glee and X Factor. And, of course, commercials for Gatorade. I guess the problem was that Sasha used it without permission, then went ahead and released thousands of copies of Naive. Orf's people objected, and the result was that TBT had to pull the album out of stores and destroy it. So the irony is now, of course, you can go to YouTube and listen to the original version of Libas Slide with the sample for free, as much as you want, which of course I suggest doing, since that version is totally badass. The other irony, of course, is that the point of O Fortuna, the lyrics, is to lament the fickle nature of fortune, viewed as a wheel that can lift you up or drag you down. And for more on that idea of fortune's wheel, I highly recommend my favorite book, A Confederacy of Dunces, which is hilarious and features a protagonist who reads Boethius and attributes all his hardships to fortune's wheel. For another, you can check out the movie 24-Hour Party People, which has Steve Coogan playing Tony Wilson as, get this, an insufferable, pretentious prick who blames his band's successes and failures on fortune's wheel. This movie is also hilarious. As for KMFDM, Sasha would fight fortune by making an end run around Orf's publisher. After releasing Angst in '93, he'd circle back and produce a new version of Naive, this time called Naive Hell to Go, with the green artwork. So it had a remix of Libas Slide without the offending sample, but it also had remixes of 4 other songs. Again, Sasha's always trying to provide value to the fans. So he remixed Die Now, Live Later, Godlike, Virus, and Go to Hell. The last of which was called the FMTV mix, since Sasha had ironically busted MTV for using the original Go to Hell without paying him. So lots of irony to go around here. But anyway, the original versions of these 4 songs then, the other 4 songs, would also be lost to time. Until the band reissued Naive as a 16-track mega album in 2006. And that version has the orange artwork, but also has the album name in orange on the cover. So it essentially collected all of these tracks into one place. However, it edited the Carmina Burana sample out of Libas Slide, so still wasn't quite the same as this original version. Are you confused yet? The other point I want to make is that the band always used the sample live. So when I saw them play in '97, they played Libas Slide with the sample prominently in place and with Ogre singing, which was super cool. And I remember being impressed that Ogre knew all of those German lyrics, but thinking about it, I guess learning German wasn't nearly as hard as remembering the lyrics to all those Skinny Puppy songs. So anyway, let's get to it here. Let's get into the meat and talk about the music. First up is this silly intro track, Welcome. It's literally just Sasha greeting the listener over some beats. It's taking me longer to describe it than it would take to listen to it. It's like 18 seconds long. So on to the next track, the title track, Naive. This is a badass disco tune, really, with vocals by Christine Seward and Sasha. It's super funky. It's got a cool bass line, huge 4-on-the-floor beat. Gunter Schultz does a really sweet guitar solo halfway through. What's not to like here? Just to confuse things further, the band would release this song on a split single with a Thrill Kill Cult. So TKK remixed Naive, and KMFDM remixed TKK's The Days of Swine and Roses, which is a pretty neat idea, especially considering they were now label mates and were sharing practice space at the time. But strangely enough, I don't have that single. I don't have that disc. They did do a video for Naive, which has some nudity, but is amazingly uncensored on YouTube. It also features Enesh picking his nose and Sasha eating a sandwich. So yeah, absolutely. This is quality TV worth watching for sure. Mostly it looks like every other industrial video of the day with lots of inverted colors and jump cuts. It's the typical stuff the guys in the H-Gun labs in Chicago were doing at the time. I'm not sure, but I'm guessing all that footage was from the Mine tour, just the guys goofing around. Then we move on to track 3, which is Die Now, Live Later. This is like a rock tune with maybe a bit of a reggae influence in the rhythm. It's not a standard dance kind of tune. And it's a good example of how KMFDM were always setting themselves apart from the crowd. They would adopt odd rhythms or sounds, but they always delivered the goods. It was always the ultra heavy beat. And this is just a quintessential KMFDM track. Christine's vocals on the chorus are just the human touch it needed to kind of counter the harshness of the drums and the guitars. And they gave a bit of what we used to call the creamy goodness. And, we sometimes still do call it that. And that goes right into the 1-2 punch with another classic KMFDM track, Piggy Bank, which has a lot of similarities to Die Now, Live Later. It's built on this beat with a really strange guitar riff. Has lots of little mini leads on the guitar, just cool guitar work throughout. And again, it's kind of funky, more cool vocals from Christine. And this is the longest tune on the album. It just kind of goes on and on. But in a good way, Then we have Achtung, which is a cool enough tune. It's maybe a bit slower than the others, maybe a little more repetitive in my mind. This is the first tune on here with N.Esh on the main vocals, all of which are in German. No idea really what he's saying, except 1, 2, 3, 4 in German a lot. I haven't listened to this song a lot because I gotta admit I'm usually in a hurry to get to track 6, which is Freed, the remix. So how do I even describe this song? It's pretty upbeat. It has a cool little keyboard riff that makes it instantly memorable. It's the little riff that comes in after 30 seconds or so. It's also got a super funky bass line and some awesome, porno-style wah-wah rhythm guitar. I mean, this song's got it all. And the lyrics are in German again, of course, though Google tells me that Fried means peace. I have no idea what they're singing about, to be honest. This remix version here is much better, in my opinion, than the original, which is on the B-side to Godlike, as I said. That version on the single is really just a beat with vocals. It's not funky at all. But this version, I think James Brown and George Clinton would approve of. Anyway, check this tune out again if you haven't lately. I think it's a gem, and as I said, it's probably my favorite thing on this album. And then we move into everyone else's favorite, which is Leibeslide. So this is the song that caused all the trouble. It's pretty killer, even without the Carmina Burana sample. Leibeslide means love song, and this definitely doesn't come across as a love song, at least with the music, if you're not following the lyrics. It's about as harsh as a song as KMFDM made at this point in their career. It has hard-hitting drums, squealing guitars, barked vocals. The first 5 seconds of this song alone, just the intro, are a great example of why KMFDM were the best at what they did at this point in their career. Their arrangements are so distinctive, you could immediately tell it was them just listening to the first few seconds of a song. And no one else could do that. No one else had figured out how to do that. They were just unique, but they also always delivered the goods. These songs all just pin you to the floor. Anyway, this song is a fan favorite for good reason. And again, they always played it live in its proper form with the samples in place. If you want to know what the lyrics mean, check out A Hole in the Wall on Angst, which just translates them to English. But yeah, love song indeed. Then we're on to track 8, which is the ever-pleasant song Go to Hell. And this is pretty much a metal track here. There's a lot of riffing, a totally sweet guitar solo from Gunter, lots of attitude. It's yet another classic KMFDM song, and pretty much showcases where they were headed musically. Although I have to wonder what my parents were thinking when I was down in the basement blasting this one and singing along. I don't know. Track 9 is the dub version of Virus. Now, this song came out as a single in '89 prior to the previous album, UAIOE, so it had been out for a year and a half by the time Naive came out. It's a pretty cool single. It's got 4 tracks on it. Most of KMFDM's early singles had plenty of tracks, and they were always remixed by the band and almost never by other bands. And I can think of one exception offhand, which was the Light single, and I talked about that on the episode about Angst. But Sasha had a real knack for reimagining songs in so many ways. I made a point to collect the KMFDM singles because they were so creative and interesting. Just the opposite of most bands who'd hire a bunch of crap DJs to put their own beats on there and call it a remix. With KMFDM, you knew you were getting value for your money. There was going to be something interesting on that disc. And the singles were almost as good as the albums. On Virus, we had the original version of Virus, the original version of More and Faster, which was also released as a vinyl-only single, the album version of Don't Blow Your Top, and High and Guile. So this last track is like a jazzy, laid-back version of More and Faster, with N.Esh doing most of the singing, and it's pretty funny. And I don't speak German, but Google tells me that Guile is German for horny, so there you go. But the original Virus is just a classic KMFDM song, beats, guitars, growled vocals. But the album version I find a lot more interesting. And frankly, it's something that your average industrial band just couldn't pull off. This is a true dub version. It's not just an instrumental with a lot of goofy effects. This is the real deal. It's the whole song reimagined in dub, and it's just a masterpiece of rhythm, and I much prefer it to the original Virus, even though the original is a classic. Also, it has to be said that this song had some interesting lyrics. I think they more or less pertain to the AIDS epidemic, but you could probably reinterpret them in light of COVID or some other things. To me, the best part about the lyrics is that they use the term poop shoot, which frankly isn't used enough in songs these days, and I'm going to try to work that one into conversation tonight. All right, so the next track is the live version of Disgust. Now, this track is on Don't Blow Your Top, which isn't my favorite album. It was their second album. Frankly, KMFDM is one of those bands that took 2 or 3 albums to kind of find their sound, and they didn't really have it on Don't Blow Your Top, in my opinion. So on that album, Disgust is quite a bit slower and weirder. It's not bad, but this version on Naive just blows it away. It's fast, it's funky, it's catchy, hits a lot harder. I really like it a lot. Now, the liner notes and the song title claim that it was recorded live, supposedly in San Francisco, but the 2006 reissue of Naive admits that it was hacked together in the studio with sampled crowd noises. So regardless, it's a really cool track and does sound like the version they played in the 1990 tour, which you can see for yourself on YouTube. Which finally brings us to the Chicago Tracks version of Godlike. Now, Godlike, of course, is KMFDM's signature tune. And you might know that it was one of the first songs that they made that featured a huge repeating metal riff. In this case, it was sampled or at least ripped off from a Slayer song, Angel of Death, and just looped endlessly over this monster beat. So the original version of Godlike came out a few months before Naive in the summer of 1990. So I picked up Naive first, and then I picked up the single a bit later. The single has what is clearly the best brute art ever. It's just iconic and awesome, and the music here is pretty good. The CD's got 3 tracks. It has the single version of Godlike, the original version of Freed, and Crazy Horses, which is actually a cover of a song that was originally performed by the Osmonds. Yes, as in Donny Osmond, who played keyboard on the original. So this was the Osmonds' first big hit that wasn't bubblegum pop. And the original, if you check it out on YouTube, especially the live performance of it, which is kind of mind-blowing, it actually kind of rocks. I mean, props to the Osmonds, so check it out. And KMFDM's cover of it is pretty straight. When you listen to the two, they don't sound that different. N.Esh sings this version, and I remember him getting asked about this song in an interview. I think it must have been in Alternative Press back in the day. And he said they did the cover because Crazy Horses was his favorite song when he was a kid, which only makes sense for N.Esh, I suppose, if you think about it. But yeah, this was produced by Paul Barker and Lee Popa, one would think in the same session where they recorded Godlike. But again, Crazy Horses was only available on CD. It wasn't on the vinyl version of the single. So again, incentives to buy CDs back in the day. But yeah, getting back to Godlike here, the Chicago Tracks version is interesting since it features so many guys from the Ministry tour. So it has William Tucker and Mark Durante on guitar, has Paul Barker on bass, and it also has Bill Rieflin on drums, which really impressed me as a kid because the drums on this track are just straight up metal, like the double kick drum 16th notes and it sounded just perfect. And I couldn't really believe that Bill Rieflin was laying down that kind of metal beat. I mean, I had seen him drum in Case You Didn't Feel Like Showing Up, but this was like next level stuff. And imagine my disappointment when I saw the liner notes in the 2006 Naive reissue, which just credited him for hi-hats, not the entire kit. Bummer! But that said, I think Bill's great. I love his drumming. He was a brilliant musician, not just a drummer. He was a great guy. Same with William Tucker, who was just a great guitarist and especially nice guy. I've heard so many great things about William from different musicians over the years. So R.I.P. and respect to both of those guys. But as the first recorded and second released version of Godlike, this one struck me as pretty primitive. It's heavy, but not very electronic. It sounded like something the band threw together in the studio one evening, which is probably exactly what it was. Still, it had the bones of the anthem that it would soon become. And that's the album, folks. There was one more related single that came out shortly after Naive, and that would be Split, which was released in 1991 in between Naive and Money. Split also had a totally awesome and iconic cover, a guy who's about to split, evidently, either on a bike or a ship. And it's another one that has a good value for the money. It has 4 tracks. Split itself was an entirely new non-album song. It was pretty cool, though I prefer the version that wound up on the Vogue single. I think I talked about that in the Money episode. The Shock version of Piggy Bank is pretty cool. It's kind of down-tempo and understated, kind of funky and groovy. The Fearing and Burning version of Go to Hell swaps most of the guitars out for synths, except for the cool solo, of course. So that's a pretty interesting take on the song. And, they threw in an edit of TKK's Naive remix for those who didn't buy the Split single. So again, as a collector, the early singles were just so important. Any 2 singles would have as much material as an album, and you'd often get exclusive tracks and B-sides, completely different takes of the material, most of which were by Sasha. So KMFDM were masters of the single for many years. Once they regrouped in the 2000s, they kind of backed off of that. Sasha said he wanted to concentrate his efforts on making good albums instead. Fair enough. I can imagine it was hard to sustain this level of output for so long. Video-wise, like I said, there is a video for Naive. There were no other promo videos to my knowledge, though the band did record some of the shows on the Mind Tour where they first played some of these songs, and those shows are mostly available on YouTube now. They were first released on the Beat by Beat by Beat DVD, which I mentioned before. So these Dallas 1990 videos are what you'd be looking for. I like these videos because the band at this point is still pretty primitive. I definitely got the feeling that they were playing most of these things live without much of a backing track. Sasha plays these kind of homemade drum triggers that were pretty unique. They were like these big strings that were just springs that were connected at both ends, and he just wails on them with like a big drumstick. And I remember he did a blog entry in the early 2000s on KMFDM.net where he rebuilt those things and kind of cataloged how he did it, which was really interesting. I've never seen another drum trigger quite like those. But anyway, you see like Rudy Naomi playing drums on that tour. Word was he quit the band when they relocated to Chicago. He didn't want to leave his native Germany. Gunter Schultz and N. Esch are on guitar. N. Esch still has hair, which is odd to see. And, watching it makes you realize N. Esch could play guitar pretty damn well, too. And anyway, it's great to watch him on stage. He had a unique look and style that I missed from the band. I said it before, but I found KMFDM less interesting without him and Gunter, though I did hang on for a few albums after they reactivated after the millennium. Also, on that Dallas video, their encore is an early version of Godlike before they had really finalized the lyrics, which is kind of interesting to hear. So why do I love Naive? You know why. Don't make me say it. It's probably the most beloved of their 90s albums. I also love that I was lucky enough to grab it when I could, so I have this early edition of it. Do I listen to it a lot these days? I haven't really, if I'm being honest, though I did enjoy listening to it again for this show, so maybe I'll get it back in the rotation. I really do love Freed and Disgust. They're probably my favorite tracks, and I would argue that they are so good that you could even play it for folks who are not KMFDM fans, and they could get something out of that. They could find something in those tracks to enjoy. Just about anybody could, I would argue. But yeah, what can you say? It's a classic album, a classic lost album. And if you don't have it, the 2006 reissue with the orange album title and the 16 tracks is your best bet. But it's still not going to have those original Carmina Burana samples. You can only find those now on the original version of the disc or on YouTube. But, I'm glad the original version is rare. There's something cool about a piece of art that can no longer be reproduced in its original form. It's a limited edition. And it's cool that we will never be able to make more of these again. It gives this version a weight or a value that it wouldn't otherwise have. It makes it special. And, with Naive itself being such a great album to begin with, it makes the original version pretty sweet to own. And that's easy enough for me to say, though, because, I have it. But there you have it, folks. Arguably the high water mark for KMFDM 1.0. Naive. Now, Money is still my favorite, but this one is up there too for me. So that's 3 KMFDM albums down and probably a dozen more to go. But, we'll get there eventually. You're listening to Stronger Than Reason, either on YouTube or as an Apple or Spotify podcast. If you like what you heard here today, please consider subscribing or leaving a comment or a review, even if it's just to throw a virtual tomato, because you can't let my head get too big, folks. As always, thanks for listening. And until next time, stay strong.